Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
This isn't just a job for me. This is something that I can do to help other kids that were from small towns like me get out in the world and experience different things.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
You're listening to part 2 of this series.
So, contrary to what some people believe, Choctaws did kill buffalo, correct?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so, what do you think the weapons they used for the buffalo were? I mean, I guess it depends on the time frame, right?
Yeah. If you're talking about the bison antiquus, which is like the Pleistocene bison, they were like twice as big as bison today. We used atlatls on those. And then when that breed or that species died out, we have, I want to say 2 or 3 different species of bison here in North America. So there's like a woodland bison and then there's a plains bison. And so when European diseases came in the 1700s, the bison population exploded because there's not as less hunting on them.
Oh,
So you
okay.
see these bison herds going all the way to Florida in the 1700s.
Wow.
And so there's bison in Choctaw homelands. And we know that because we have place names that talk about Poa Tikva, which means it's talking about going out and gathering the hair. Because the bison, when they're shedding during the spring, they'll rub up against stuff to get their hair off. And then after they leave, the women would come out and collect all that bison wool and they'd spin it.
How neat is that? I had no
Yeah.
idea.
Mhm. So, yeah, later on, bows were used to hunt bison. So, like a lot of people say that when we came on Trail of Tears, we had never been to Oklahoma before. It was like a new frontier. But all these Choctaw warriors and hunters have been going to what is now Oklahoma for over 40, 50 years because we'd go on the Owachito or the Great Hunts,
Okay.
and we would travel on horseback with Choctaw ponies. We'd travel all the way out to western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma and hunt bison. So,
And the eastern Oklahoma was kind of Caddo territory, right?
yeah, by that time, a lot of the Caddo people had moved south into
Okay.
Louisiana, but you had other tribes that were in that area too. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's all these stories about Choctaw hunting parties that are basically entering into skirmishes with the Osage, with the Caddo, later on with the Comanche, stuff like that. Just as we're trespassing on other people's lands to go hunt,
Yeah.
we're fighting, those people that were, trespassing in. So
True.
most of the time we beat them up and we were just fine. And then we come back home and the Creeks would beat us up. So,
Yeah, there we go.
yeah, that works
Everyone
out.
had to be a warrior back then, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
was survival of the fittest.
Hmm.
Speaking of these battles, I assume there was also hand-to-hand combat, right?
Hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, going back to some of the different weapons. So we're talking about clubs and tomahawks later on. There's a description that talks about Choctaws having javelins. We're not sure what that means because it's from a European point of view. So
Okay.
I don't know if it's just a spear or maybe it's a throwing spear. We're not quite sure.
Hmm.
But Choctaws were defensive warriors. So um, a lot of times when we were attacked, we were pretty good at repelling attacks and then following.
Mhm.
And, and other times, really good at ambushing and doing strategy. Because with the chiefs, to be a war chief, is a huge honor, but it's something that you also have to earn. You're not always, you have to have ability. And so when you take a war party out, if you lose too many lives, then that title was kind of stripped from you and a new war chief would be appointed. So a lot of times, Choctaw war chiefs were always super focused on preserving life during battles. So we'd go out on a campaign, fight, but in the end, what we focused on was, limiting our casualties as much as possible. So even if we just, inflicted, a few wounded or killed a couple people, that was enough,
Yeah.
because people had to come back home. They're not just warriors, they're fathers, their uncles, their sons, their nephews. And so, it was important for people to come back home as
Yeah.
well.
Interesting. And that is kind of a different mindset as compared to some other tribes
Mhm.
who there were variations in thinking for some of the other tribes, correct?
Mhm. There might be. I'm not sure. I know about Choctaws. That's
True, true. For
yeah.
instance, I know that some felt that to die would be a great honor, so it wasn't as imperative that everyone comes back. And then there were some
Mhm.
tribes that truly it was about wiping out
Mhm.
everyone you come in contact with that could be encroaching on your territory or could be some other rivalry that had taken place. And we'll learn a little bit more about the Choctaws' way of thinking when it comes to fighting in just a bit. What
Mhm.
about the horses? So I know the Comanche, for instance, and even the Kiowa, they were really skilled warriors on their horses. They would even use them
Mhm.
as shields in battle. What about the Choctaw?
So, Choctaws originally got horses from the Caddo in about 1690 is when we started trading with the Caddo for basically these Spanish Mustangs from the Southwest. And so by the mid 1700s, we had these massive herds of Choctaw ponies. And so, every man, had a horse. And so we would we would ride out on a horse, but Choctaws would dismount before they fought, just like
Okay.
just like a lot of Southern cavalry did during the Civil War. And so you would ride out to wherever you were going, you would dismount, and then you'd use ambush tactics from there in guerrilla warfare. So
Okay. So
yeah,
it sounded like in a way they were protecting their property, their horses, their Choctaw ponies to some degree, or do you think it was for another reason?
it's just our fighting style. It's just how we were
Yeah.
trained to fight and to hunt is
Yeah.
because we were skilled. A lot of the different stories talk about how skilled Choctaws were at not being able to be followed. So we were good at covering up our tracks. Some men were known to wear bare feet, so that the tracks that they left were, bear's feet, bison feet. I was reading about it the other day and just talking about some of the different animals and so like it talks about how a Choctaw war party would always walk in a straight line. So
Ooh,
there'd be the person in front would have some sort of foliage that they would carry. And so that way,
okay.
if they had to stop the war party real quick, they had something that they could hide behind. I guess it would help them blend. The war chief would be behind them, and then you'd have the rest of the warriors. And so they would all march single file. And when they got into enemy territory, they would step in each other's footprints so that if someone came across, you wouldn't know how many people were in the war party.
For sure. That is so smart. To this day, Choctaws are good business people. I think that strategy helped them back then as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, you had to be shrewd in both, your battle tactics and also your tactics as home too.
You sure did. I sometimes wonder what was it like to live back then, always in fear of someone coming along and taking your life or your children or your wives or whatever the case, you know?
Yeah. So the mindset that Choctaw people had is, it's different than a lot of American thinking that we had today. So as Choctaws, we understood that we were part of the natural cycle,
Hmm.
just like all animals and plants are. So Choctaw people believed that, when the Great Spirit or God, Creator, Hashtaghli created us, we were created as stewards to the animals and plants, but we're all still part of that same cycle. So there's this great documentary I watched on Netflix called My Octopus Teacher. something like that. And this guy talks about how he's going through a hard time, so he starts swimming in the ocean, and he creates this relationship with this octopus. But throughout the whole story, he's talking about how he's an invader to that biome. And so, he's watching this octopus try to defend itself from a predator, and he's trying to stay out of the situation because he views himself as outside. And so the whole time I'm watching this, from a Choctaw perspective, I'm like, no, you are part of that environment because you're coming in, because you're interacting with that octopus, you're now a part of that environment. And so that's how Choctaw people thought, is we were part of the same cycle as everything else. So,
Interesting.
To die would just be this next part of our journey. That's why when we say Chipisalachiki, we'll see you again, that means we'll see you in this life or the next. And that's because of our belief system of, when you die, and so you would pass away, you would then travel to the afterworld. And after you passed judgment and you went to the afterworld, you would join your ancestors and you would literally see that person again. So
That's beautiful.
it is. And that's why if you passed away here, it didn't matter in the
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, we do have stories of suicide, and, we have stories of Choctaw warriors doing dumb things. And it's just, a part of it is that free, kind of that free spirited attitude of, this is just one part of our journey, and that
Yeah.
it continues and that it comes back. And so, you also have to remember too that the male population at this time period, because of diseases and warfare. So what had happened is in the 1520s, European diseases start rampaging through Choctaw homelands. Um, Millions of people die in 200 years. Like 90% of the North American population was wiped out by European diseases.
Wow.
And so within that first 100 years, um, millions of Choctaw speaking people pass away. And so Choctaw society is rebuilding itself and trying to come up with new things and new ways of surviving and pulling in these other Choctaw speaking people to build ourselves back up. And that's how we became the largest tribe in the Southeast, is because we absorbed all these other Choctaw speaking people in to create the Choctaw Nation later on.
Makes
But
sense.
what happened is, Europeans, they come into this vacuum and they start all these colonial conflicts. So they're pushing colonial conflict. We always have conflict with our neighbors. And so one of the mindsets that Choctaws had is that, like the French wanted us to wipe out someone one time. The Choctaw chief was like, why would we wipe them out? Then we have no one to fight. So, and
That's
it wasn't about,
awesome.
yeah, and it wasn't about warfare between nations. The issues were between communities. So if one Choctaw community was at war with a Muskogee community, they weren't at war with all Muskogee Nation, just that one community.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so, because these are like, each community has its own, it's not like a whole nation as we think about them today. We are the Choctaw Nation, but, we were um, a bunch of Choctaw speaking people that were culturally similar and were aligned together, like a confederation,
Makes sense.
basically.
Yeah, and there were the clans and the Moedes
Hmm.
and all that.
Hmm. So,
I never thought about that, that it was one nation, but it was separate
mhm,
little
mhm.
entities.
Yeah, and of course, Europeans used that against us, and that's why eventually we created the three districts with the three different chiefs, and that was a way to
Oh,
combat Europeans because, you know, the the Spanish would come in and, to some of the southern chiefs and be like, "Hey, we'll trade you all this stuff for this land," and the southern chiefs are like, "We don't own that." Sure, like,
yeah.
because, when the Spanish go over there, they're going to get attacked because they don't have permission to be there. And so, of course,
Right.
that didn't necessarily work out well once we realized the Spanish are writing all these things down on paper. So, you know, um, So that's why we created this kind of three district approach to having three chiefs representing all of our. At the time of the Dancing Rabbit Creek, we had 60 chiefs representing 60 villages. So, but that's why we had that three district type of government that came over on Trail of Tears too.
We'll be back after this quick break. Are you in the medical field looking for your next opportunity? Listeners, I'm proud to introduce you to Native American veteran-owned staffing company, Worldwide Medical Staffing. Owner and CEO Jackson Weaver is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a service-connected disabled veteran where he and his team staff for commercial healthcare and government entities such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and DHS, and specialize in staffing Indian Health and VA hospitals nationwide. Isn't it nice to know that our veterans are being cared for by staff who have been handpicked by a veteran who's been in the staffing business for 17 years? Healthcare job seekers, check out these open jobs on www.medical.com. If you're seeking temporary, long-term, or permanent placement of physicians, advanced practice, registered nurses, and more, check out www.medical.com. And Diakoki to our medical professionals and to those who have served our country. So regarding our warriors, was there painting of our bodies, faces, whatnot?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So when Choctaw men would get ready for war, some of the things that the way that they would dress and the ceremonies they would perform were really similar, almost the same to when we would get ready to play stickball too. And so, because stickball is another way of doing war, but in a way of less death. But Choctaw men would adorn themselves with feathers quite a bit. We would paint ourselves. And so I think we don't know what colors. Now, the colors for war and death were red and black. That was really common, in the Southeast in general. So you would see Choctaw men, dressing and, using face paint and body paint in red and black. But they may have subtle things that they did based off of their clan or their moiety that they come from too, that we don't know about. Sometimes they would, before they go to war, they would put like red dye like in their hair too. So they would kind of put like a red dye in their hair.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so it depends. Other times you see them dressing in full white. So they're using white clay to cover their faces and their hair and everything. So they're almost completely white. But white usually symbolizes peace. So that was something that you see a lot during peace negotiations when our chiefs would travel to another village to end conflict with them and we, do peace negotiations. You see that quite a bit. The other thing is too is that you couldn't tattoo your chest or your body until you were a Tvshka. So the men would tattoo themselves, and their tattoos were based off their exploits in life. So if you were, walking down the trail and you saw a Choctaw man just covered in tats, you'd go to the other side of the trail,
Oh.
But that's another thing too, is that if you looked at a Choctaw man and you saw his tattoos and adornments, he had to earn all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So you could also tell by looking at someone how good of a warrior or how good of a statesman or that type of thing that they
Right.
are. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And did the women get tattoos as well?
They did. Women have a lot more facial tattoos. We don't know a lot about tattoos. There's not too much written. There's not very much written at all, and there's only a few drawings and paintings. And it's hard to tell if it's just a face paint or if it is a tattoo. The Six Towns women did that tattoo that comes across and splits. So I hit my mic. Yeah, it comes across and it splits. But that's something that only the Six Towns women did.
So what tribes were we typically fighting against?
So after Europeans come in, we primarily see a lot of fighting against our brother tribe, the Chickasaw, and then our other related Muskogean tribes like the Muskogee or the Creeks. That's generally on and off throughout the 17 and 1800s of who we fight. Um, Sometimes there's accounts of us fighting the Shawnee. The Shawnee were allied with the English and with the Creek. I saw a little bit of fighting with the Casardi or the Cashatas. Um, we probably fought a little bit with the Alabama as well, which is another one of our closely related tribes. Um, but then, Choctaws would always move, when we went west. We were good allies with the Quapaw, for example, because they were a French ally. Um,
Okay.
and so there were all these different tribes. Like, it's really interesting. You go up the Mississippi River and you have all these different tribes that are all French allies, except for the Chickasaw. Everyone hated the Chickasaw. And because they just, created chaos everywhere they went. So all these French allied tribes hated the Chickasaw, but the Chickasaw were fierce warriors and they were in a very defensible area. And so they were extremely hard to fight in their own homelands. And so the French were never able to wipe them out. They spent 30 years trying to wipe out the Chickasaw and could never do it. But on and off, we warred with our brother tribe. Um,
What do you think
because,
those wars were about with the Chickasaw? Or what was it because they were allied with the English?
so the English were sponsoring slaving raids. So in exchange for Choctaw slaves being sold to go to the Caribbean, um, they would get guns and ammunition and other trade goods. So
Oh
the
my
English
Lord.
sponsored, yeah, they sponsored slaving raids for both the Muskogee and the Chickasaw. But then um, we also did slaving raids on other people around us too. And so that was a
Okay.
way through war that you could also help with the loss of life during disease and stuff like that. You'd usually capture women and children. They would be brought home and they're basically second class citizens until they were acculturated. And once they understood the finer points of Choctaw culture and they, were assimilated into Choctaw culture, then they would be adopted into the families.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's our traditional kind of form of slavery. Um, it's,
Do you think in the Caribbean today there are Choctaw descendants?
that's something that we've been trying to research. We know that Choctaws, men and women and children, were brought to Charleston or Charlestown at the time. And then from there, they were sent to the Caribbean. We don't know where. That's something that I've been interested in that kind of research in years, for years, but I just haven't found an expert in that area yet. And we haven't really had any kind of push to research that yet either. Um,
Yeah.
the loss of life was really hard. I mean, that's why they ended up, moving forward with the African slave trade is because Native people didn't have those immunities and they kept dying in the Caribbean. But but it is possible. I mean, I don't see how it's not possible that, there isn't people with Choctaw ancestry in the Caribbean, just as there is all over
Right.
the Southeast.
Somebody,
Yeah.
if you're listening and you're from somewhere in the Caribbean, take a DNA test, see if Native American is part of it. Would be interesting. And then contact Ryan and myself, please. Thank you. Were we successful in battle against most of these tribes, you think?
For the most part, I mean, it all comes down to um, skill and luck. So fighting in the Southeast is, it's not these European kind of chess battles where people are, it's all about strategy. It's about preserving life, but also taking life at the same time. So, um, all these different accounts, I think when we start going through some of these different war stories, you'll see, just kind of like what it was like. But for the most part, these war parties on average were about 30 men, but they could go up to 250. It just depended on, what the need was, what need
Yeah.
arose.
And so, with that many men, I'm sure that there wasn't one clan, for instance, that may have 250 men. Were they gathering different people from different clans?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So,
Interesting.
yeah, the war chief had, so the Tvshka usually had two lieutenants called the Tvshka Oshi. And so they were kind of like his captains, his lieutenants, and that helped organize the war parties and everything. And then he also had something called a Tisho. The Tisho was like a valet or a servant. And so he was in charge of keeping everyone fed. So the warriors would bring their own, usually like a corn powder with them. It's a parched corn powder. Every warrior was supposed to bring so much food with them for their journey. And then so what would happen is this Tisho would go to each of the warriors and take a different amount, and that's what they would use to feed everyone. And then they're also hunters too. So they're
Sure.
subsistence hunting, they're gathering what's ever available that time of year, and also using the corn that's provided by their family. And that's how they're kept fed. And
Yeah.
then he would assist with keep the fire going, stuff around the village. I mean around the campsite.
Mhm.
So he may have been like maybe like a young man, like a hata kamita that was of like senior status, could be. Or it could have been someone, that they just didn't have, a good role as a warrior, but they had a really good role, um, at providing an organization and that sort of thing. So,
Stay tuned for part 3 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.